Welcome everyone to the next GPC seminar. Aditya is going to introduce our speaker in a moment, but before that, I just wanted to say a few words about the seminar. This has been going on for a couple years now, and it's been highly successful. So the topical group on climate physics, the GPC, has kept it going, and we're happy to do it. So the format for today, since usually we have like a webinar format, but for some reason this one's set up as a regular Zoom meeting, I'm going to try to encourage everybody to make sure that you are muted. I see that not everybody is muted, so please mute yourself. If you have a question during the talk, I ask that you just put it in the chat, and we can try to have our speaker Rama answer the question during, if it's like an important question, clarification question, she can answer it during the talk. And then at the end, we'll open it up and you can unmute yourself and ask questions like it was any other, in-person seminar. Okay, well, if that sounds, we have two more virtual seminars for the year. So I encourage you to check out the GPC Engage website, which I will put the link in the chat. And please sign up for those if you are interested. And with that, I will give it over to my co-host, Aditya.
Thanks, Justin. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rama. So Rama is a senior professor and dean at the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, which is a part of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bangalore, India. She received her PhD from the Indian Institute of Science and then did a postdoc at Caltech. She is a fellow of the American Physical Society and the 3 Indian National Academies of Sciences. Also a winner of the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize and a distinguished alum of the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. Rama's group focuses on a lot of fundamental problems in fluid mechanics, including multi-phase flows and cloud physics, and she is going to share some of that interesting work with us today. So with that, Rama, welcome, and really looking forward to your seminar.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you, Justin, for this opportunity. So I want to draw your attention to particle-laden flows in general, and you can see by this list, do you see my cursor? Yeah, so this list that it's an extremely complicated problem when you have large numbers of particles in fluid, and we're going to focus only on 2 kinds of problems in this situation, which are listed here. Basically, you're going to ask about marine snow and raindrop formation. So what is marine snow? We know that we are putting a lot of anthropogenic carbon into the atmosphere, and we are lucky that marine snow, namely plankton and other life forms, are here to help us. So basically, when we these creatures actually suck up atmospheric carbon and sequester it by taking it to the deep ocean, and that happens because these particles, they slowly sediment through the ocean and take it to the deep. So that's the first thing, where something like 30% of anthropogenic carbon is actually cleaned up by these creatures. So marine snow is a very, very important thing for our lives. And the next thing is raindrop formation, where again, it's like a whole bunch of little particles. Typically, cloud droplets are about 10 micron in size. They grow to 10 micron by condensation. And after that, a million of them need to coalesce to make just one raindrop. So for every raindrop, you need many, many million collisions, which will lead to a million coalescences to make each raindrop. And so we are seeking large numbers of collisions. And in marine snow, we are seeking clumping because clumps sink faster. So these basically clumping, coalition, coalescence, these are the things that we are looking for in these 2 situations. So I've divided the ways in which we can achieve this into 3 things. One is meandering, and one is clustering, and the third is clumping. So what is meandering? Meandering is when a particle, instead of sinking straight down, does elaborate horizontal motions to quite great distances. And when it does this, it can increase its propensity for collisions and meeting other particles, and it can form clumps, it can form coagulated big clumps. So like meandering is a good way to meet other particles and collide more. And meandering happens due to shape differences, like when the particles are not spherical but they have other shapes, and we'll talk about meandering in some detail. And then there is clustering. Turbulence is one way in which clustering is achieved. By clustering, I mean that in this little box, so remember that particles are not in a incompressible field. Like we'll call u as the velocity of the fluid. So del dot u is 0 because in the ocean and atmosphere, things are practically incompressible. But del dot v, where v is the particle velocity field, could be greater than or less than 0. And regions of clumping are where del dot V is less than 0. That means the divergence is negative. So more things are coming in and fewer things are going out. So we're looking for this kind of situation, and that can happen due to turbulence and due to interparticle interaction. How does it work in turbulence? You see it in this movie. So basically, there are vortices you see here, and particles are thrown out of the vertical regions and they're clustering into the strain regions. And so in the strain regions, del dot V is typically negative. So like you have more chances for collision. And we'll be talking about this parameter called the Okubo-Weiss parameter, which is the vorticity tensor magnitude square minus the strain tensor magnitude square. So wherever Q is positive, the flow is vertical, and wherever Q is negative, the flow is strain dominated, and particles like regions where Q is negative. So the other way in which del dot V can be less than 0 is by clumping, and this happens due to interparticle interactions, and we shall see how. So when particles see each other, they tend to clump, and how that happens. So all these processes are actually a race against time. The point is, in the case of marine snow, you want them to get sedimented as fast as possible before they can remineralize. So the sedimentation time should be shorter than the remineralization time. Otherwise, they'll just remineralize and get spread back into the ocean and into the upper ocean, and that wouldn't help further sequestration. Similarly, in raindrop formation, you want the growth of these raindrops to be shorter than the lifetime of the cloud, to be faster than the lifetime of the cloud. Obviously, because if the cloud dies before raindrops form, we're never ever going to get rain. So these are the things to remember. And now we'll talk about 4 different situations depending on the time that we have. So the first will be this meandering thing that I told you, which happens due to shape, which is basically a departure from stability, from sphericity. And the second thing is cooperative settling. I may not talk about it in this order. Cooperative settling, which leads to clumping. So when you have an array of particles rather than just one particle, how do they just talk to each other and clump? And then we're going to talk about how turbulence does this. So these are particles which are not talking to each other. There's just 2 vortices in this problem, and how particles go and cluster in a most extreme way. And the last thing is sedimenting in viscosity gradients. We'll see why that's relevant at all, and that also leads to a kind of meandering. Now, the first part of this talk is going to live in steady Stokesian flow, where the particles are so very small that their Reynolds number relative to the flow is extremely small. And so in the Navier-Stokes, you're dropping the left-hand side and you're just solving for the right-hand side. And under this situation, we all know this high school problem where you have a little spherical particle which is just falling under gravity in an extremely viscous fluid. It's a small particle, or the viscosity is extreme, whatever. The Reynolds is very, very small. And this particle reaches a terminal velocity which is dictated by a balance between its buoyancy reduced weight and the drag force, which is the famous 6 pi eta v, that formula. And so there should be an A over here, I'm sorry. So A is the radius of the particle, and the particle's response time is given by the density ratio, the kinematic viscosity, and the radius of the particle. So this we all know about spherical particles. When dropped under gravity into a viscous fluid, they just fall in a straight line. Now, what happens when there are two particles? So there is two particles which are identical, separated by a distance d, and by Stokes-Let, by pretending that both of them are point particles and d is much, much bigger than a, then we can get a formula for their terminal velocity. They also fall vertically down, nothing to get excited about, but they fall slightly faster than each of them would by themselves. So now you're beginning to see that clumping makes things fall faster. So if there's two rather than one, they fall slightly faster. And this is, you can get this by applying the Stokes-Let formula. Now, if the two spheres are not horizontal, but they're separated at some inclination like this, then instead of falling straight, they take a path which is it's inclined to the horizontal, inclined to the vertical, so they can actually have horizontal drift as they fall. Now, instead of a sphere, if you have an ellipsoid of any kind, what happens is that an ellipsoid practically behaves like two spheres. So it kind of drifts exactly as two spheres would do. And so we can say that ellipsoids are drifters. By drifting, I mean they go in a particular constant velocity, but that velocity need not be purely vertical. So they drift as they fall. Now, let's take this system, the ellipsoid, and remove just one of its symmetries. We know that ellipsoids have three planes of symmetry: left, right, front, back, and top, bottom. So let's just choose to remove one of them. And then you get this object called a dibilateral, which basically I attribute to Harshit because it was his idea to study particles of this kind. So then what you do here is you take, let's say, an ellipsoid, and then you bend it. So you start getting a shape like a cashew nut. So this is something like a cashew nut, except that, you can either leave it as that, or you can slap it a bit in its bottom and get a cross section like this. So you're getting something like a saddle shape on one of its sides, just to make it more interesting. But this thing has two planes of symmetry. So we have cracked the problem for any object that has two planes of symmetry. So this is a much, much, much better way of approximating random shaped objects which are falling, like either plankton or ice falling in clouds, than it is to model them as ellipsoids. So like 100 out of 100 papers on these falling objects, now maybe something like 90 would be on spherical particles, and another 9 would be on spheroidal or ellipsoidal particles, maybe 9.9. So only very, very few studies exist on when particles are not ellipsoidal. And the case I'm going to make here is, do not model them as ellipsoids, model them as dibilaterals, and you're going to get something much, much more realistic than if you model them as ellipsoids. So why do I say this? Now, if I take a normal body and I apply a force on it, like our high school knowledge tells us that I will move in the direction in which the force is pushing me. So a linear force results in linear motion, a torque results in rotational motion. This is good for spheres and ellipsoids which are sedimenting. But for this dibilateral, there is a translation rotation coupling. So like here, in any steady Stokes flow, I can relate the velocities and linear and angular velocities of the object to the forces and torques we apply by the resistance matrix. So this is the formula. Now, in our case, we're applying only gravity in the z direction, in the z direction. In all the other directions, there's no force, and we're applying no torque, no external torque on the body. However, because this resistance matrix is not basically a diagonal matrix, it has these off diagonal terms, B13 and B31. You're going to get, and this is representative of absolutely any dibilateral. So you can see this book for reference. Now, this thing can couple rotation and translation. So when I'm giving a vertical force, I can have rotation. That's basically the summary. And these off diagonal terms actually appear in the dynamics in terms of these two non-dimension, these two, everything is non-dimensional, these two parameters alpha r and alpha p, and only the product of these two is going to matter. So we're basically reducing it to one thing, which is based on the shape of these particles, which is the product of alpha r, alpha p. And we'll see how these bodies can flutter without wind. So like here is x, y, z, y is the gravity direction, and p1, p2, p3 are the axes which are oriented along the body, and the dynamics of this body will be represented by the dynamics of this coordinate system itself. So like we write down the dynamics of this coordinate system, except that we split it into things which are parallel to the gravity direction and things which are perpendicular to the gravity direction. And now if I look at the components perpendicular to the gravity, parallel to the gravity direction, I get this very simple system. This like has nothing else except these three variables. So the vertical motion is decoupled from the horizontal motion. We can actually solve for the vertical motion independent of everything else. And this itself is a three-dimensional thing. It's non-linear, but there is a conserved quantity in this given by that. And this conserved quantity makes sure that the motion in the vertical direction is always periodic. So you can get nothing better than periodic, nothing more interesting than periodic in the vertical direction. However, in the horizontal direction, things get more interesting, because like this thing, the horizontal motion depends on the vertical motion by this matrix A of t, which is periodic. So now I can do a Floquet analysis for the horizontal motion, and I can get the complete dynamics of any dibilateral, so long as I know alpha p and alpha r, which are just shape dependent quantities. And now if this quantity mu ty is the period in the vertical direction, if mu ty is rational, then you can see that every n periods in the y direction, I'm going to get a repetition. But if it's irrational, I'll never ever get a repetition, and so we will get quasi-periodic motion. So nothing else is possible in this body except periodic and quasi-periodic motion. And this part was actually argued for by this other paper, which beat ours by some months. So in Stokesian sedimentation, there's three kinds of motion. It just depends on this product. There's settlers, drifters, and flutterers, depending on the sign of this object. Point to note, drifters, namely ellipsoids, are a very, very, very small minority of the kinds of behavior you'll see. Most bodies are either settlers or flutterers. So don't go by drifters, go by one of these, because a vast majority of particles are one of the other two. So like this is just one example set we've designed where, you know, we've bent it by this distance A and we've slapped it in by this distance B, but you can design a whole bunch of dibilaterals. And Harshit performed boundary integral method simulations only to associate shape with the resistance matrix. So once you know the resistance matrix, you can solve for it directly. So here's what a typical settler will do. It will reorient in such a way that its bent direction is oriented downwards, and now we're moving along with the body. So after this, it just settles asymptotically to a constant velocity and constant orientation. What does a drifter do? It reorients till it reaches a particular direction, and then it continues like an ellipsoid would do. What does a flutterer do? And I call it fluttering without wind, because, you know, all of us have seen leaves flutter in the atmosphere, but leaves cheat because leaves let out vortices, they shed vortices. But these poor guys can't, they're in very, very, very viscous flow, and they do not shed vortices, but still they do fluttering. And here's what their dynamics looks like. I hope you like it. It's quasi-periodic motion as it falls down. Okay, so let's go to the next problem. So we're now going to talk about another reason why translation and rotation coupled. So we're still living in steady Stokes flow, and we're going back to spheroids. And so we know that spheroids can only drift. They cannot do any interesting motion if they were in constant viscosity fluid. But now Arjun showed very beautifully that if they live in a viscosity gradient. Now, why would they want to live in a viscosity gradient? Now, almost every living thing in the ocean, or many, many living things in the ocean, actually live in a viscosity gradient, as shown by these two papers. So, viscosity gradients happen because they spit mucus, typically because they spit mucus. So then, because they live in these viscosity gradients, how do they interact with each other? What do they do as they fall down? All of this becomes something where we have to take the gradient of viscosity into account. And this is what Arjun has done in a most beautiful way. So what we do is we take, we have like completely analytical solutions for this problem, and by using reciprocal theorem we can actually look at the entire range of aspect ratios of spheroids, from something which is absolutely needle-like to something which is absolutely plate-like. And we say we are living in a small viscosity stratification, and because of that, and small and linear, and because of that we write perturbation solutions. The zeroth order equation is just what would be the Stokes solution where viscosity was constant. And the first order solution gives you this U stratified and sigma stratified, the shear stress, which are dependent on the viscosity stratification and the Stokes result for these ellipsoids. So once we do this, we can actually solve for everything. And we're going to be talking about gravity in this direction. And stratification it need not be perpendicular. It could be in any direction in this plane. And we're going to be looking at things in the gravity stratification plane. So then what happens is that, suppose we now release two particles. We saw that when the viscosity is constant, these two particles are just going to go in a straight line and they'll never change the distance between them. But now, because there's viscosity stratification, there is an immediate rotation of these two particles given by the magnitude of the viscosity gradient and crossed with the gravity. And now what happens is that because of this rotation, they give different velocities on each other and they can move relative to each other. So this interesting thing can happen. But the two body problem is already very complicated even for spheres. So I'm going to talk now about the one body problem, where we just have a single spheroid. And what all can a single spheroid do? A single spheroid can do like different behaviors in each of these. So you already see it's like a huge, rich problem. Now, kappa is the aspect ratio of this object, which goes from very, very oblate, like flat plate-like things, to very, very needle-like things over here. And like the behavior changes across this range, and there's some interesting bifurcation happening at certain kappas. And then this is the orientation of the stratification with the gravity vector. So if the stratification and gravity are parallel, something else happens. If they're perpendicular, something else happens. So we get entire classes of behavior depending on this, where you are in this stratification and aspect ratio plane. And so you can get closed loops which happen here, like you get closed orbits, you get limit cycles in some of these, you get stable and unstable limit cycles in this part and this part. You get limit cycles which are oriented differently. So you could be oriented in the direction along the gravity stratification plane, perpendicular to it. And so all kinds of interesting things can happen. And then you can have saddle points which are approached and departed from by these trajectories, and the body itself can orient in a whole range of amazing ways because of this. So this is the stratification vector. It's given by dg times the gravity vector plus something along the direction which is perpendicular to both stratification and gravity. So this is basically the thing. And now here we see some examples of the kinds of dynamics. So each of these is a closed loop. in the gravity and perpendicular to that plane in those coordinates. So you see closed loops of this body, and the torque is given like that. And then there are sample spiral dynamics. Here I've shown some unstable spiral which starts from that fixed point and goes around, 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 and reaches a limit cycle like this. And then, like that limit cycle, as it falls down, down, and down, the body could be executing motion like this. So all kinds of interesting things happen. So I'm done with that part. So shall I move on, or do we have questions at this point?
I had a quick question, Rama,
Yeah.
since you're requesting questions. If so you showed that the gradient viscosity if it's in the same direction as gravity, does anything matter then because it's a cross product?
Yeah, so if it's in the same direction as gravity, basically you'll get closed orbits which look like Jeffrey's orbits.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I
Okay.
don't see any questions in the chat at the moment,
Okay.
so why don't we go ahead and keep going?
Okay. So we talked about steady Stokes till now, and we're still going to talk about steady Stokes. We'll go to unsteady Stokes in the last part of this talk. So we just saw that if I have two spheres, then like they're going to sediment this way. And if I have these two spheres, they're going to sediment that way. And what if I have three spheres? So then what happens? Whoops, the movie is now showing the three spheres, like this sphere is going to go that way, this sphere is going to go that way, and both of them together are going to make the middle one fall faster. So this is a beautiful mechanism for clumping or cooperative settling. So that's what happens when there are three spheres. And here's the movie with five spheres, and you see clumping. This is an actual experiment done by Rahul Chajwa. So you already see that when there are many of them, they tend to clump. And we talked in the beginning that we want to see clumping. This is one of the aims of our life right now. So Crowley in 1971, in a beautiful paper, showed that if I have an array of spheres, that array is always unstable, and you get clumping in the valleys of these perturbations, and declumping, or rarefaction in the hills. So you always get clumping. So that's the moral that Crowley gave. So we're going to question that moral when we use spheroids. So with these co-authors, I've looked at the problem of what happens when you have an array of spheroids rather than an array of spheres. And this experiment was performed by Rahul, and the corresponding theoretical work was performed by Harshit, and they were ably advised by Narayanan on the experiment, and Sriram on aspects of the theory, along with, of course, something by me, I hope. So yeah, so then these objects that we made, they were all disc-like, and we pushed them through this comb structure, and we just watched them sediment into silicone oil. So this was basically the experiment. It took much more and a huge amount of hard work to get clean experiments and clean up a lot of the problems that we faced along the way. So we are perturbing these things by at some wavelength lambda, and we do that by rearranging these things along the comb and missing out some of those holes and things. So then when that happens, we can show that there is the usual Crowley, which is pushing, these bodies to clump with each other. But remember, now that they're spheroids, they're going to get orientation. So they're going to get torque acting on them. And this torque is going to act in a direction such a way that it's going to pull them apart. So there is a competition between Crowley and this particle orientation, which makes them drift. So there's Crowley versus drift. And who wins? This is the question we're going to ask. And here there's an interesting turn of events. Normally, you can have you can perform a stability analysis and see which eigenvalues are growing and which eigenvalues are decaying, and you'll have growth along the positive eigenvectors. But in this system is non-normal. That means the matrix that describes the stability is non-self-adjoint. And when that happens, you can get transient algebraic growth even when exponentially all the eigenvalues are decaying. So here's an example, which is like a high school example. You can play with it. So here are two eigenvectors which started out at time equal to 0. At some later time, this eigenvector decayed to this one, this eigenvector decayed to this one. So like you're in a decaying system, exponentially decaying system. However, the resultant of these two grew. And that's because these two things are not perpendicular to each other. So you can actually have transient algebraic growth. So things can go bad in for short times, and at long times everything has decayed to 0 if the system remain linear. But this could kick the system to non-linearity. This growth could make the system non-linear because the growth can actually be enormous. Now, we can break down the stability matrix of our thing, which is x and z, the two directions, and the orientation, the orientation variable theta. And now you get this. Actually, the matrix can be broken up into the sum of two matrices. One is the standard Crowley operator, which is unstable, and the other is actually a harmonic oscillator. So these things are actually beating like a spring system. And the combination, the sum of the two, makes it non-normal. Although each of these independently would be normal and nothing interesting would happen. Now what happens? Suppose you had an ellipsoid there and an ellipsoid here. The top ellipsoid would get turned in this way by the bottom ellipsoid would get turned in this way by the top. So they tend to form a T. This is how like pair interactions happen between them. So they tend to form this inverted T shape. Now, if you look at the wave number of the perturbation and the lattice spacing, like how far away these spheroids are placed, in that plane, if you see what happens, you see that there is a regime in which Crowley wins. So the usual exponential clumping happens. And in
Rama,
this region, drift wins.
we had a
Yes?
quick question in the chat, if
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah. The question is the Crowley instability inherently one-dimensional, or is there a two-dimensional analog?
There is a two-dimensional analog. So if you have, instead of an array, you have a two-dimensional plane of things falling, you would still get the same instability.
Okay.
And that changes a little bit when you have ellipsoids or, spheroids.
Thank you.
So now the interesting thing is that there's a regime in which you get this exponential growth, and there's a regime in which drift wins. Namely, you remember that drift tries to stabilize the system. So drift is all about stabilizing the system. So the growth rate of the instability, the exponential growth rate, has gone down, down, and down over here. But here, because the system is non-normal, you still don't get them, going back into where they started from, which is what they would do if they were perfectly stable. You get some non-linearity, which drives them into this T formations, inverted T formations. So now, let's look at what happens. And one of these is an experiment, and one of these is Stokesian theory with first reflection, some improvement on the boundary conditions. And I'm willing to bet that if I interchange these two and told you this one is experiment and that one is theory, you'd believe me. So they're that similar. It's just amazing how Stokesian theory gets this right. So and we've done it in 2 points, the red one and the green one. So those are the 2 points in which we've done experiment and theory. And this is Rahul and this is Harshit. So you see these T formations, which we'll try to see in a movie. So this is the standard exponential growth. I've just shown you the experiment, and you see the Crowley type of clumping happening. It's a pretty clean experiment, if I say so myself. And here is an example of algebraic growth, which drives the system to nonlinearity. That's experiment. Oops. That's experiment and that's theory. They don't seem to want to play at the same. Oh, yeah, they are. So you see those inverted T's, kind of inverted T's, which then fall very fast, and the T's have a tendency to, take other orientations together. So, like, here's another comparison of experiment and theory where we actually looked at how the orientation of these two particles P1 and P2, the two particles are with respect to gravity, and this corner corresponds to that orientation, this corner corresponds to this, and so on. And you see that in the experiment, which is given by the black dots, and the theory, which is given by the color, you see that the highest propensity is for the inverted T's. So this is a very interesting kind of non-linearity where they choose A, pairing versus clumping, and B, they choose to form only these inverted T's. So I don't know whether that matters for carbon sequestration, except that it's bad news that these guys don't like to clump, and therefore they're not going to fall so much faster that like we expect. So shape is going to change the answer for us. That is the basic summary here. Okay, so I'll go to the last part of my talk, which is basically moving to inertial particles in unsteady Stokes and doing a kind of a model for turbulence. Up to now, we've only been talking about sedimentation when everything is calm in the world. But now, if these particles are living in the presence of some vortices, that's the basic question we're going to ask. And here the Reynolds number of the flow is going to be way greater than 1. And the Reynolds number of the particles with respect to the flow, Q is U minus V, the relative, this is Q, which is the particle velocity minus the local fluid velocity. And this is going to be way less than 1. Remember that the particle itself is teeny tiny, so A is very small. The two non-dimensional numbers we're going to talk about are the Stokes number, which I told you about a particle relaxation time. Now I've scaled that relaxation time by some typical time scale in the flow, and that gives a Stokes number. And then there is a density ratio. There's a number which is representative of the density ratio of particle to fluid. So that's the R parameter. So when you have R equal to 0, you have an infinitely dense unrealistic particle, and when you have R equal to 1, you have neutrally buoyant particles. And now for the unsteady Stokes is more complicated than steady Stokes. These particles have some inertia, and this is the equation which describes their dynamics. You will see this very messy term which includes an integral from 0 to t, and also a term which goes like diverges at 0 time. And these two things are going to make it very complicated. Together they're known as the Bassett-Boussinesq history force. So we have a clever way of computing it. Otherwise, you'd very soon be killed by the amount of RAM and storage you need, because for every time step and every single particle, you have to go back to time equal to 0 and do this integral up to time t. So my colleague Vishal Vasan came up with a brilliant way of solving this, without which we would be totally stumped. So we are using this clever method to solve this equation. And now, what's our zeroth order expectation? Our zeroth order expectation is what we saw on the first slide or so, where, particles get, pushed out of vertical regions, and therefore they're kind of clumping into strained regions. There's a slightly bigger number density of particles, but I mean, it's not convincing that the collisions are going to be so very much more so as to give you raindrops or something like that, which you really need. So this argument alone is nowhere near enough to make raindrops. But let's see the details of this kind of clumping. So in order to study the details, we first study one very simple problem, and this is to convince you that there are more such simple problems to be studied. So our system consists of just two identical vortices which are co-rotating. So here are two co-rotating vortices, and this is work done by Somav, Divya, and Rajeshi. What happens here is, and Rajeshi is doing the new part. So these two people have done the part that I'm going to describe today. So here, what we're going to see is we just got two identical vortices, and in the absence of everything else, and suppose you were in inviscid flow or very, very high Reynolds number flow, then if gamma is a circulation of each of these vortices, and if gamma was very, very big, then they would just keep going around in circles. So they would just execute this circle again and again and again, and that's all that would happen to these two vortices. So then, and because they'd have this kind of azimuthal velocity, I mean, I've just written the answer for point vortices, but that's fairly good. So then, and they'd have a time period, like a rotation rate, which is given by this. So then, we throw particles in this vicinity. So what we would expect is that, oh, they get centrifuged out so fast that everybody leaves the vicinity of these two vortices and they collect in some faraway region. But that's not what happens. Already there's a contradiction to that story with just two vortices. So here I've drawn in a rotating frame. So remember, these two are just executing circular motion. So I could, live in a coordinate frame which rotates with these vortices. And then in that coordinate frame, these vortices would go nowhere. They'd just be these two red blobs you see. And now if I throw Stokes equal to 0 particles, namely particles with no inertia, so they are just passive particles which follow the flow, they would execute, closed orbits like this in the rotating frame. And now these closed orbits are just cam tori. So nothing interesting happens to this, because each of these tori is basically going to, trap all the flow within it, and nothing is going to get transferred from outside to inside. However, if you have some density ratio and some higher Stokes, then instead of following all these cam tori, particles go to strange attractors. They can go to strange or non-strange attractors, but they can go to something. But in this particular example, every particle in this black regime, which is somewhere around here, they all go to an attractor. They don't stay in these cam tori. So, and because they go to an attractor, there is extreme clustering. So in other words, you get the divergence del dot V going to minus infinity. So we already talked that del dot V less than 0 is when they cluster. But these things are actually going and collecting into a place which is of smaller dimension than the original dimension. So here we started with 2D, and they go to 0-dimensional, 1-dimensional, and some other fractal dimension. So because they're converging into a fractal dimensional object, they're going through extreme clustering, and here's a lot of chance to make raindrops or whatever, although this is an idealized flow. So at different Stokes numbers, different interesting things happen. That means as you increase the inertia of the particle. In fact, you get a beautiful period doubling bifurcation from going to a point-like attractor to a limit cycle, and that limit cycle breaking into more and more complicated shapes until you get actually chaos at this Stokes number. So a very, very interesting period doubling bifurcation to chaos, which obeys, the Feigenbaum ratio and blah, blah, blah. It obeys everything. So this kind of beautiful pattern is hidden in just this clustering of two particles in a vortex, two vortices and a bunch of particles. And in some cases, so the interesting thing is that this thing we've done without including the Bassett-Boussinesq history term. So we just wanted to see what is the effect of that term. Is it so important? Everybody throws it away all the time. Should we always include it? And we see definitely some differences with Bassett-Boussinesq history. So and then there are situations, this is just one simple example, but when I have other R and other Stokes, if I explore this non-dimensional number territory, then I'm going to get some places where I have period halving bifurcations, where you get period doubling, then halving, and back to 1. And then there are these gaps where no particles get trapped. They all run away just like you would have initially expected them to. So you get gaps like this. And the story is very, very different with Bassett-Boussinesq and without. And here you have an elaborate period halving bifurcation, and here you have something else. The basic moral is that the Stokes number at which such bifurcations take place and up to which trapping can be done is actually enormously higher than you would imagine without Basset-Boussinesq's history. So my final question is that if all of this particle dynamics can happen with just two vortices, what all can happen in turbulence? And that needs to be studied. What patterns, what bifurcations, what other things that we didn't dream of happens in turbulence? It's not just a trivial case of, strain regions give clustering and vertical regions give declustering. So that's basically the moral of this. And so here is the summary of my talk. We first talked about dibilaterals, and I think it will hold for other bodies, where we saw very nice things like fluttering without wind and, this quasi-periodic motion. And we then went to spheroids, and then we asked what if there's more than one. And when we saw that, we said that, the basic dogma that clumping is inevitable whenever there are particles is wrong. Spheroids, in fact, show pathetic clumping. They actually form these T things. And now, instead of these bodies, suppose you have viscosity stratification and just one spheroid, we saw a whole range of rich dynamics. And then we saw how simple vortex arrangements can drive particles to show extreme clustering in very, very interesting ways. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Rama, for the fantastic talk.
Thank you.
So at this point, what we'll do is anybody who has a question, feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Okay, well, maybe I'll get things started. I have a question. I want to bring it back to marine snow, since you were talking about how much carbon is sequestered, that, eventually collects and falls to the ocean. So this clustering, is this happening with the formation of these aggregates of marine snow? Do you think that these shaped particles are being brought together through the same clustering mechanisms that you talked about?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so these aggregates that you collect in the ocean by putting, dishes which capture them, those are all due to this reason that they're clumping due to various reasons. So it could just be interparticle interactions, it could be turbulence in the ocean.
And so so you build these fractal-like clusters or whatever. Do you have a sense of what these more complicated shapes generally do, since they're not spheroids or ellipsoids, or I'm just interested in the statistical kind of, transformation of, random fractal-like marine snowflakes into what their dynamics are?
Yeah, so we've actually 3D printed some objects like that. And we were actually also 3D printed some crystalline objects, and we're seeing how they fall. And one thing we know is that the terminal velocity or the speed with which it's sequestered is not going to be very easy to work out.
Gotcha.
So there's a lot of unexpected things which happen in these things. So they're typically slower, but sometimes they can be faster than anything you would expect.
Great.
And depending on their shapes and the orientations, these terminal velocities can be very different.
Other questions?
Can I ask? Hi,
Yeah,
Rama.
please,
This is
Menon, go ahead.
Hi,
Thanks for the nice
Narayanan.
talk. Hello. Thanks for a lovely talk. I was wondering, one of the things you mentioned early on as a motivator was the cloud problem, how you collect raindrops. Is any of these things implicated in that? There's no real shape there, right? Is it vortices important, or
Yeah.
what's the thinking on cloud on?
Yeah. So in raindrops, vortices are going to be important, but a simple-minded argument that these vortices are just going to push them into strain regions that alone is nowhere near enough to explain raindrops, because you need 1 million collisions for every raindrop, and that simply is not happening just by increasing the collision kernel by a factor of 10 or something like that. You need to do much, much more. And this kind of thing, the last thing that I spoke about, is going to give much more hope to explain that, basically because you have these interesting mechanisms which are hidden in this turbulent flow, where clustering of an enormous level can happen. And by studying caustics, we're getting some ideas of where in the flow this can happen and what kind of history these particles should go through to attain these extreme clustering things in a regular turbulence where you do not have a simple arrangement. But in every turbulent flow, there are vortices which are in the vicinity of each other. So together, these vertical arrangements are going to create more interesting clumping than otherwise you'd see. Is that what you asked, Narayanan?
Yeah, roughly. I just wanted to know if that problem lives in the regime you described, largish Stokes, small particle Reynolds, and
Yeah.
is it known that more vorticity in the large scale flow produces more raindrops?
Yeah, more Reynolds number in clouds should produce more raindrops. Yeah, that's basically the thinking, but I couldn't vouch for it. Like, there aren't, measurements which simultaneously measure Reynolds number and raindrops. But the more turbulent a cloud is, the more hope you have. In fact, a lot of the clouds, the fluffy white clouds you see, are not that turbulent. So that's only a correlation, not a causal connection.
And then just a follow-up, you were talking about the BBH history term in the last slide, and I was looking at the Stokes number and just trying to match things up. So you had mentioned that most people throw it away. Can you give us maybe a final word on what you think? Should we be keeping it all the time, or when can we throw it away?
Okay, so the answer is not clear to me. We've done things where we ourselves throw it away. So the answer is not clear to me. But if you had an infinitely dense particle, then you'd be safe in throwing it away. And like we often fondly imagine that in the cloud, raindrops are 1,000 times heavier than air, and so they are infinitely dense. But it turns out 1,000 may not always be big enough. And certainly, like for plankton and things, we should play it safe and not throw it away. Because when the densities of the fluid and particle are comparable, then the Bassett history is going to be important.
Even at low Reynolds numbers, like less than 10 to the minus 2?
Yeah, this Bassett history term is basically a Stokes term. It's an unsteady Stokes term.
It's a DVDT term, yeah.
So it's basically the memory of the boundary, the memory of where the particle went, it carries with it, and the boundary layer which is created on the body, or the skin friction which is created on the body, carries with it that memory.
Fascinating. Thank you.
So yeah, like sometimes that can be a long memory. Like without Bassett history, things would relax exponentially fast, but with Bassett history, they relax algebraically.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. So with that, unless anybody wants to speak up, we will close our GPC seminar, and I'll encourage everybody to sign up for the next one. I think we have Raymond Pierre Humbert, who will be talking in February. And again, I will post the link in the chat for the seminar series one last time. And hopefully we'll see you guys at some of the upcoming ones. And we'll thank Rama one more time for the wonderful talk, even though it's very late where she's at.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Appreciate it. Okay. Bye, everybody.